Thank you.
Okay, listen, good afternoon, folks. And yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to be here and, and present here today. I've had the opportunity sort of earlier this afternoon to listen into the previous speakers, and you'll find a couple of common threads running through. But I suppose at the outset, I want to just acknowledge that although I'm based at Queen's, and I'm speaking here, I suppose, as somebody representing the Institute of Global Food Security and the School of Biological Sciences at Queen's University in Belfast. You'll notice that a couple of my slides are branded slightly differently. So, as Tracy mentioned, I previously had a role with the Department for International Trade, and then I had a role with the British Veterinary Association. So I'll mention BVA sort of through, and some of the BVA activities through some of my slides. I'm also then, until recently, I've been a director, one of the founding directors of a community interest company called Vet Sustain. So you'll see actually that some of that collaboration, that transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaboration even comes through just as we go through my slide deck. But as you also heard, One Health, this sort of interface between people, animals, and the environment doesn't stop, at companion animals. What I want to talk to you about today is those links then through into agriculture as well. And obviously that then links with food and feed. So feed going into animals, food then going into people. So in terms of our meat and our dairy products and so on as well. So this is the kind of doom and gloom slide. Why is there so much focus on One Health and sustainability? And if you want to think of it in terms of One Health being part of the journey and sustainability being some kind of end goal, where everything's in balance. Okay, so economics are in balance, and environmental issues are in balance. One Health is part of the journey to achieving that. Farmers can't achieve that on their own. Veterinary surgeons can't achieve that on their own. Environmental scientists can't achieve that on their own. But when vets work with farmers, work with environmental scientists, work with other stakeholders within the food supply chain, we can actually really make a difference then. So this is the doom and gloom slide. The very bottom note, both Deborah and Anna have previously mentioned antimicrobial resistance and some of the outputs from the O'Neill report. Rather than us just kind of sort of say, well, it's all those, human medics that are giving out antibiotics like Smarties, or the human medics sort of saying, well, it's all those vets and farmers, feeding antibiotics by the bucket load. We all have to work collaboratively. We have to work together to reduce, refine, replace antibiotics and our use of them. I'm just working backwards up the list now. So 75% of new infectious diseases are zoonotic. That means that they can spread between people and animals and vice versa. And here we are sitting, hopefully, well, touch wood, towards the end of the COVID pandemic, where we've obviously had some kind of spillover event from a wildlife population. It's gone into the human population. It's become humanized. But there have been cases of interactions, with mink, or with cats, and particularly big cats in zoos that have caught COVID and possibly even given it back then into humans again. But ultimately then, sort of going back up towards the top of the list, unprecedented rates of species extinctions. And we've gone from talking about global warming to talking about climate change to now talking about a climate emergency. And those links between people, animals, and the environment have never been so important as they are just now. There are lots and lots of reports out there, linking agricultural production and food production to the environment and how we move that forward. But we know that we need to create more food. If we're going to feed a population of 9.8 billion people by 2050, we need to be able to create more food. But it's not just about creating more food, because we waste a lot of the food that we produce at the minute. So let's reduce that waste, but look at ways of improving food production in a sustainable fashion. So it needs to make economic sense. We can't be producing food that is too expensive for people to actually buy. But equally well, we can't compromise on things like animal welfare and the environmental impacts. So it's all very well thinking about, we could produce vast amounts of meat in feedlots. But if we produce vast amounts of meat in feedlots, we possibly need to cut down parts of the rainforest to grow soya, to grow those animals, and keep up with that. So we need to find some kind of balance whereby we can use the agricultural footprint that we have and produce food more efficiently. So lots and lots of reports that are out there, lots of strategies, lots of people with good ideas, but we need to convert that now into action. So here's some of the kind of things that, the agricultural sector is looking at. We're looking at better management of fertilizers and manure and grassland. We're looking at animal genetics and health and reproduction. We're looking at integrating beef and dairy systems so that the male calves that are coming from the dairy sector, can be used in beef production. Feed additives that reduce methane, okay? Intercropping with different types of cover crops, looking at energy use and even generating energy on farm, and then looking towards agroforestry, so more use of trees in our agriculture, and looking at organic systems. So these are just some of the examples, but you can see there that your average UK farmer is not necessarily going to be an expert in all those things. So you need to be able to bring all of those different disciplines together so that we can work through that. And that absolutely applies then in terms of the human medical profession, and interests in and around human nutrition and human well-being in that respect, linking across into the veterinary sector as well. Regenerative agriculture, and look, I'm not going to go through this, in a lot of detail, but it's just again to give you a little bit of an example. These kind of wildflower meadows, or what we call herbal lays, are not just there to look pretty, but they do serve a purpose in that they are improving biodiversity over just having a field full of ryegrass. So by having some of these other types of plants involved, they have different types of root structures, which will improve the soil nutrition. But just one of the examples is we use a lot of wormer to kill the worms in the stomachs of our cattle and our sheep, so that they remain healthy. And the worms are perfectly natural. There's no, they just go through this sort of life cycle, and that they dung out onto the pasture, and then they will later ingest some of the eggs and larvae from the pasture, and they'll go through this this kind of life cycle. It's perfectly natural. But we use wormers to actually control the clinical effects of that in the livestock. Now, the problem is that those wormers also then kill the dung beetles. And the dung beetles will help to break down manure on pasture and get it absorbed into the soil to act as a natural fertilizer. So how can we strike a balance? Well, actually, some of these herbal lays containing things like chicory will allow us to use a bit less wormer, which will then, you'll still have healthy animals. You'll still not have a big worm population within the sheep or cattle, but you'll also not kill the dung beetles. So the dung beetles can then do their job at absorbing the nutrients into the soil and helping with that process as well. So it's not just about these kind of wildflower meadows looking pretty. There is actually a functional aspect to it as well as improving biodiversity as we go through as well. So that's just another example of One Health, where you bring those knowledge from the different sectors together. We have Brexited, we've left the EU, but the EU still has a profound effect on how we produce food and feed. I'm sitting here in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, we have about 4% of the UK's human population, but we have 17% of the UK's cattle population. So we have an awful lot more cattle than we do people, proportionately to the rest of the UK. And obviously, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, you'll have heard a lot on the news about the Northern Ireland Protocol. We almost kind of are in a sort of limbo situation where we remain with a footprint within the European community as well. So farm to fork strategy it's not a perfect document. It doesn't mention vets very much. And the role of vets in sustainability and the role of vets in food production. However, one of the things that it does talk about is circularity. What does that mean? We talk about circularity and circular economy. Well, one example of that is around what we call carcass balance. So we tend to eat the muscle from a carcass. So whenever a bovine animal or a sheep is killed for food production, we tend to eat the meat. We tend to eat the muscle. But what about the rest? So the rest becomes a waste, otherwise a waste product. But let's think about how we can use that sensibly. We tend not to eat an awful lot of offal here in the UK, but that can be used. It can either be exported to countries that do eat a lot of, kidney and liver and so on, or it can be used for pet food. So traditional pet food, although there's a big interest now in vegetarian and vegan diets for cats and dogs, and how we can do that sensibly. Or even the use of insect protein. And I'll talk a little bit about insect protein later on when I'm talking about aquaculture. But actually, normal pet food is part of the sustainability picture. Whenever you think about that carcass balance, those other bits of the carcass that we don't eat but are actually fit for human consumption can go into the pet food manufacturing supply chain and produce really good quality pet food. So normal pet food actually can add to a circular economy and a sustainable approach to agri-food production. So let's talk a bit about One Health, and I think at least a couple of our previous speakers, I think maybe Rob and Deborah, have both mentioned Virchow, but let's start with right at the start. So Hippocrates was the first to mention, if you want to start to learn about a population of the health of a population, look at the air they breathe, the water they drink, and the places they live. So really, right back, a couple of millennia, and Hippocrates already was making links between human health and the environment, okay, and even the role that animals played within that. I always think this photo of Pasteur looks a bit like Luke Skywalker, but Pasteur was another guy who was way ahead of himself. He linked veterinary medicine and human medicine really from quite an early stage, and was the guy who in 1885 vaccinated a boy. This is before people really understood what rabies was all about, but he knew that he passaged something through rabbits, and he got an extract from the rabbits, injected it into a boy who'd been bitten by a rabid dog, and saved the boy's life. So this is vaccination in its emergency vaccination in its earliest form, and Pasteur had kind of worked that out, and he knew that there was a link there between the dog bite, the dog, and the boy. And how he could then use this extract from the rabbit, that he was able to create this vaccination. Virchow, and this quote has been mentioned, between animal and human medicine, there are no dividing lines, nor should there be. This guy was way ahead of himself. This guy talked about meat inspection before meat inspection and proper abattoirs really existed, but particularly around trichinella, which is a little worm which can affect pigs and can be transmitted through undercooked pork into the human food chain. So we do a lot of our meat inspection now around trichinella testing, because of work that Virchow did in the late 1800s. But this guy, he talked about systemic autopsies, he talked about typhus, he described leukemia and embolisms. So he again, a guy who had this knowledge that there was something between humans and animals that was definitely worth having a look at. And fast forward now to Calvin Schwabe. And Calvin is a guy who's an epidemiologist, which means that he studies the spread of disease. And he was the first chap to have a joint appointment at the University of California, Davis in the medical school and the veterinary school. So again, there was this understanding that infectious diseases would cross over and could cross over between people and animals, and the growing sector, around veterinary public health and public health, and the knowledge that there was around public health, which really is part of what we talk about in terms of One Health. So that's kind of a potted history of where One Health has brought us from, with some, agricultural examples. I quite like this because this sort of cartoon that's from Sweden, because again, from a farm animal perspective, it really kind of helps to embrace where we are with, with One Health and the links between environmental health and veterinary public health and human medicine, zoonotic infections, and then translational medicine, or one medicine as we talk about it now. And Calvin Schwabe was really the first guy to really coin that phrase around one medicine, and the links that there were between between human and veterinary medicine and how we approach diseases. Now, I think if we were going back to talk about One Health, and we were going back to the very start, and we could redefine it again, we'd probably actually talk about one well-being, because I think there is an acceptance now that health and welfare are inextricably linked. So the health and welfare of people is inextricably linked. The health and welfare of animals is inextricably linked. And we don't really talk about welfare of the environment, but certainly the health of the environment then is linked to that as well. So sometimes it is useful to be able to kind of separate them out, but often we think of health and welfare as being part of One Health. So this is a working definition that the One Health Commission used. It's about collaboration, it's multi-sectoral, it's transdisciplinary. It's working at all these different levels. It's not just some kind of big global fluffy thing that goes on between countries. It's local, it's regional, it's national, it's global. Okay, and some of the examples that you've heard already from Deborah and Anna have really underpinned that this starts, One Health starts with, that young boy who, was playing football, right up to, sort of our global approach to things like rabies and antimicrobial resistance. But it's about achieving optimal health and well-being and recognizing the interconnections between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So next wee bit, I'm going to talk to you about some of the work then that the British Veterinary Association has sort of carried out over the last few years. So BVA is the representative body for vets in the UK, and the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons is the regulatory body. So the two organisations work together through the Vet Futures Initiative to look at what the veterinary profession might look like by 2030 and the things that were going to be affecting the profession. And a couple of things that sort of came out of that, a couple of actions that came out of the strategy and the initial action plan were an animal welfare strategy, so looking at aspects related to animal welfare, and then the setting up of the UK One Health Coordination Group. And that brought together British Dental Association, British Medical Association, it brought together the National Trust and the Wildlife Trusts, and it brought together the BVA and British Veterinary Nursing Association and a number of other bodies. So bringing together people, animals, and the environment. Getting those organisations working together then to look at where there were examples of One Health that could be showcased, and that's what we ended up with in the One Health in Action report. We've talked a lot about sustainable animal agriculture. So what does that mean? What does sustainable animal agriculture actually mean? So yes, it picks up on things like antibiotic usage. It picks up on less and better. It picks up on things like welfare at slaughter, whether animals are stunned or not before slaughter. It picks up on health and welfare plans and routine visits and biosecurity. And of course, then on the back of that, we produced a number of resources to allow vets to talk to farmers around things relating to the use of antimicrobials. Talk a lot about farm quality assurance. So you see all these kind of labels that will appear whenever you you know, go and get your milk from Marks and Spencer's, it'll have RSPCA assured on it. What does that actually mean? What does that mean in terms of One Health sustainability? And actually breaking that down, it's about use of antibiotics, it's about the veterinary involvement on farm, it's about measures to protect the environment, and so on. So that's some of the story behind those labels. Even though we've exited the EU, we still play a very important role within the Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, which doesn't just cover the EU, but actually covers the entire continent. And I was involved then in chairing the FVE Food Safety and Sustainability Working Group, and looking then at some of these different pillars around greenhouse gases and circular economy and food safety and animal health and welfare, antimicrobial resistance and innovation, linked to One Health as part of the sustainability picture. So that's work that continues to be ongoing with FVE. So just to talk a little bit about Vet Sustain. The last thing we needed in the UK was another membership association. So we set up Vet Sustain, a group of us set up Vet Sustain as a community interest company to look at creating toolkits and resources for veterinary surgeons in and around sustainability. So we took the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and we created our own 6 easy to use veterinary sustainability goals. So there we're talking about wildlife, we're talking about net zero warming, so the environmental aspects, we're talking about no waste, we're talking about a good life for animals, so using really up-to-date evidence-based animal welfare terminology, health and happiness of our animals, of our vets, and of our animal-owning public, you know, whether that's farmers or pet owners. And water is a really, really important part of that. So enough clean water for all. We then created a veterinary practice checklist. So this was a means, a very basic tool to get vet practices on board. So vets, vet nurses, whole practice teams, so practice managers, getting everyone involved. And rather than sort of a small group of, you know, very environmentally aware vets trying to save the world, it was much better to have the entire veterinary profession starting to take some small steps and to make some changes. So you can see the main pillars there: practice responsible resource use. So looking at waste within the practice, use of electricity, energy suppliers, things like that. Be sustainable in your operation. Thinking about things like anesthetic gases and protocols for, practice vehicles, for example. Use medicines responsibly. So again, we're back to antimicrobials, we're back to use of antiparasitic products and putting an evidence base behind that. And empowering the team. You know, we want everyone to be involved and get behind this. So look, I'm just going to give you, just finish up sort of within the next few slides, with a few examples. So Meloxicam. Meloxicam is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. It's a wee bit like paracetamol or ibuprofen, but it's a wee bit toxic to humans. But actually, it's a really, really interesting drug for use in dogs and in cattle. It doesn't, with any medicines, you're always sort of balancing off the effects with the side effects. And the side effects, unfortunately, were a bit too common in people. And so therefore, meloxicam is not used very much in human medicine, but it is actually a really useful drug, particularly in cattle and in pigs. Omeprazole. This is a drug that was initially designed for treating the ulcers of horses. Now, in the UK, we tend not to think of horses as being food-producing animals, but in other parts of Europe, they are. But this is designed to reduce the effects of stomach ulcers in dogs and in horses. And derivatives of this drug, I take it myself. I have a condition called Barrett's esophagus, and I take esomeprazole, which is a derivative of this particular drug. So again, we're thinking about translational medicine, medicines that have gone from, maybe from animals into people or from people into animals. And the last one is ivermectin. So ivermectin is a really interesting one. There was a lot of talk around ivermectin during COVID as to whether ivermectin might be useful in the treatment of COVID. I think the jury now is well and truly on the camp that really ivermectin is not particularly useful for COVID treatment whatsoever. But Ivermectin is one of the drugs I was talking about earlier on in relation to being a wormer for cattle. So it kills the worms in the tummies of cattle and sheep. It is, however, also really useful in human population for the treatment of river blindness. So this is a condition that will take place in sub-Saharan Africa. So we think then in terms of when we're controlling animal diseases, we think about things like cleansing and disinfection. We think about stocking density. We think about movement restrictions. So if anybody can remember back to the foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001, all movement of animals around the country completely stopped overnight. Think about biocontainment. So that's whenever an animal gets a disease, we try to keep it isolated. PCR and lateral flow, vaccination to control and prevent diseases. Herd immunity, this idea that within a population of animals, we can try and get some immunity built up to dampen down the risk of an infection causing an outbreak. And certainly in terms of epidemiology, we talk about the reproducibility index, so how easy it is for one animal to infect another animal or affect another number of animals. Now, some of that might sound a wee bit familiar, because actually all these things have translated into COVID speak. So cleansing and disinfection, we went nuts for hand sanitizer, 2 years ago. Stocking density, that's the same as social distancing. Okay, it's how close animals are together and the risk of diseases transferring. Movement restrictions, we went into lockdown. Biocontainment, whenever we go PCR positive for COVID, we go into isolation to stop others becoming infected. PCR and lateral flow are, common speak now. We all know what they are. Vaccination. Does anybody know where vaccination came from? Vaca is cow. And the very first vaccine was actually created in and around by Edward Jenner for using a cowpox isolate to then vaccinate against smallpox. Herd immunity, there it is again. And certainly in the early stages of the pandemic, there was plenty of talk about R0. It was reported on the news at 10 every night, and the reproducibility index. I said I would mention aquaculture, and aquaculture is a really interesting one in terms of people, animals, and the environment. There's a real social science aspect to aquaculture, because our aquaculture sector in the UK is largely based in quite rural areas and Highlands and Islands and the west coast of Scotland. So there's a social aspect to that link between people, animals, and the environment. Well, actually, in terms of sustainability and One Health, we start then thinking about, okay, is it sustainable to feed our fish with fish meal that's created from fish that are harvested from one part of the ocean to then create fish food to feed to our fish in Scotland? And that then leads us on to thinking about things like insect protein. And, we can feed insects on waste byproducts from human processes. So brewers' grains, distillers' grains and things like that. Waste fruit and vegetables and off cuttings and things like that can be used to grow up black soldier fly larvae, which can then be used as part of a protein source for fish food. So really thinking about sustainability in that respect. I really am coming to the last couple of slides. I'm going to do a couple of quick plugs. Deborah plugged her book, which I can highly recommend. I helped review part of that, but we wrote a book chapter for this, One Welfare and Practice, the Role of the Veterinarian, and chapter 2 is all about sustainability. My colleague, Sean Wensley, also released this book last week. For people that are really interested in kind of the One Health sustainability aspects of food production, particularly around animals, I can highly recommend this book. It's really nicely written and describes a lot of the up-to-date animal welfare science really nicely. My contact details are there. You can get me on Twitter and certainly on LinkedIn. My email address is there. And there's a few references at the end as well. So look forward to questions during the panel session, but I'll hand back to Tracy just now for our next speaker. Thanks very much.